When it comes to fashion illustration, it's capable of giving us a completely new approach to fashion. I mean, the ideas are endless when it comes to the different ways people are expressing their artistic vision when it comes to this. I mean, it can take you into a completely new world. It's something I've newly fallen in love with, starting with the book Mr. Slowboy. And when you dive into the history of fashion illustration, at least for me personally, it has allowed me to appreciate fashion illustration even more. So it's really interesting how this all started, dating back to the 16th century when global exploration resulted in an interest in the dress and the costume of people all around the globe. So these books were created to represent the dress of different social classes and cultures to get rid of the fear that people had for these global discoveries. So from 1520 to 1610, collections of wood blocking, etching, and engraving were published containing examples of the clothes people wore from the different social classes and cultures. And these were the first drawings specifically dedicated for the modern fashion illustration at the time. And these illustrations made their way to tailors, dressmakers, and clients, all encouraging new designs. So you already begin to see how important fashion illustration was at this time, serving as the only source of new ideas and evolving the fashion for this time period. So this is what's really cool. These journals began to be published in France and England in the 1670s, and these were considered the first fashion magazines, such as the ladies magazines, Le Mercure Galant, and a few others. So the amount of journals increased due to the increased readership of women keen on the latest fashion news. And later down the line, the men's fashion did the same thing as well. And this is where fashion plates came into the play in the late 18th century to the early 19th century. So these fashion plates can be described as illustrations demonstrating the highlights of highly fashionable clothes produced by etching, engraving, and lithograph, and then being hand colored. So from my understanding, it seemed like they were already doing this, but they gave it an official name and also improving these fashion plates tremendously down the timeline. During this time, women could get their hands on fashionable dresses much easier, which resulted in an increase of journals in the 19th century, all including fashion plates. And these illustrations started to include more information on the latest trends for this time period and also provided general dressmaking instructions. Also in the 19th century, hand-colored printing got replaced with full-color printing, and this is where the fashion plates began to evolve. Fashion plates began to represent two figures to represent that garment. One from the front and one from the backward side, providing more angles, making it easier to copy for clients, tailors, and dressmakers. For the 19th century, the overall focus for fashion illustrations was to improve the details, the accuracy, and provide more general information. So as we moved to the 20th century, fashion illustration started to become a profitable business. The work that these artists were producing started becoming industry, providing new merchandising for department stores. And this is said what started the culture of shopping. In 1915 to 1925, French magazine Gazette de Bonne formed a group of young artists who had the freedom to interpret fashion of their own. And as we dive deeper into the future decades, this can kind of be described as the building block for what fashion illustration became. So approaching the 1920s to the 30s, this can be described as the golden age for fashion illustration. Every commercial artist was considered a fashion illustrator, being able to draw garments with immense details such as the textures, the colors, and even the weight, fabric, and construction of these garments. But what's very interesting and actually very contradicting is that during this time, this also represented the decline of fashion illustration as a whole. In the 1930s, technologies began to develop photograph and printing, allowing for these photos to be placed directly onto fashion magazines. Photos started to replace illustrations in fashion magazines, and it was even reported that photos sold better than illustration, according to Vogue in 1936. So this is where it gets even more interesting. So before photos, illustrations had to be exact duplicates of the garments they were drawing to give clients, tailors, and dressmakers an exact idea of what they were getting. But since photos were able to serve that exact purpose, fashion illustrators were able to express their artistic vision, creating new methods and creating new ideas. And it's really funny how photos became the downfall of fashion illustration, but it also presented a completely new world for fashion illustration as well. And this is probably a big reason why fashion illustration is where it is today. During this time though, the fashion illustration industry as a whole continued to be on a decline as editors invested more into photos than illustrations. But kind of the silver lining of this is that the illustrators from before had a new job, which was to focus on articles more than their illustrations, which is, in my opinion, is not the worst case scenario. And this is all taking place leading up to the 50s and 60s. And the only thing that was keeping fashion illustration alive was Vogue's Harper's Bazaar with work from Christian Beard, Eric Carl Erickson, and Marcel Vertes. So while fashion illustration was on the decline in the US and other parts of the world, what was going on in Japan was the complete opposite. And it's funny when you think about the role Japanese fashion has played on the history of fashion, and more specifically Japanese Americana, but that's a story for another time. So in the 1960s, Ivy League fashion was presented to Japan for the first time. It was a completely new culture, and the citizens of Japan had no idea what this was. Ivy League first appeared in the brand Van Jacket, a Japanese brand obviously, with branding partner Men's Club magazine. And they had to win over Japanese citizens to this new idea of fashion. So the plan was to really take Japanese viewers into this completely new world of this foreign style of Ivy League fashion. But with no place in Japan that looked like England campuses, because that's what the Ivy League fashion was, a fashion in England campuses or colleges, they could not rely on photos to create the vision they were going for. So you see kind of where this is going. The only possible way to get the vision they were going for was to rely on illustration. So Men's Club magazine gave their artists complete freedom to create what they wanted, which resulted in one of the most iconic illustrations for Japanese fashion illustration. So taking a closer look, a pioneer of fashion illustration in Japan, Kazuo Hazumi. Kazuo, being the fashion illustrator of this time period, created one of the most iconic illustrations to represent Ivy League fashion. He created an illustration made up of woodblock. He replaced a line of samurai with 14 different styles of Ivy League fashion, all with the same cartoon-like figure, becoming one of the best illustrations to represent Ivy League fashion. And this part of the fashion illustration history is really cool because you can really see Kazuo Hazumi's impact on fashion illustration back then and how it still has an impact on fashion illustration today, which we will get into later. So this all took place in the 1960s, and it's such a coincidence how this all happened as fashion illustration was on a decline. How you have one side where it was completely at the bottom, and in Japan it was completely at the top. But going back to the overall picture of fashion illustration, a couple of decades later, as fashion illustration continued to be on a decline and went through what was described as a renaissance period in the 80s, a group of young artists came into the picture that did work for magazines during this time, such as Cold Nat's Vanity and The Visionaire. And one of the biggest turnarounds for this time period was the advertisement campaign for Barney's New York that featured a very beautiful take on fashion illustration, which was presented in 1996. So from the 1990s and so forth, you have obviously technology improving tremendously throughout this time period, going into the thousands, such as the use of Adobe and social media, allowing for fashion illustration to become pretty much a new thing, allowing for a whole new world of new ideas. And it's really cool to see all the different visions and the new ideas that people have come up with when it comes to fashion illustration. You have Dick Carroll taking on the idea of magazines like Mad and comics from the 50s. You have Andrew Moshinoff taking on his own version of Ivy League style. You have Wes Robinson. You have Mr. St. George's taking on the idea of street style, with the bear being the protagonist of his drawings. And you have so many other artists with their own vision of fashion illustration, showing how many ideas are possible when it comes to this art form. And it's honestly like a breath of fresh air, having the ability to find a new source of inspiration when it comes to fashion. And one of the things that sticks out to me the most that's really cool in my opinion when you look back at the fashion illustration history and how it has an impact on today, Mr. Slowbo, the book I kind of talked about in the very beginning of this video, referenced Hozumi in the beginning of the book as kind of like a source of inspiration for the book, and also serving as a mentor for Fei Wang, the artist and illustrator of the book, going back to what Hozumi did for Japan and fashion illustration, and seeing how it has inspired Fei Wang to make a book of his own closer to this era of fashion, seeing how major it was back then and how somebody's able to interpret fashion on their own but still having that inspiration from what was so iconic back then. And you can kind of see the similarities between the two. And another thing that sticks out to me is how the book really pulls you into the imagination of a gentleman walking in London or New York, and it really draws you into that style of clothing and even the settings of the drawings that he did, and even all the different colors, the silhouettes of the garments. I think this book is really made to perfection as far as the vision he was going for, and how it really pulls you into this whole new world of fashion when it comes to his Ivy League or the style that he was going for. So like I said, fashion illustration is something I newly fallen in love with, and it's honestly just a great way to express new and pretty much limitless ideas for fashion. So that's pretty much it for this video. Let me know how y'all feel about fashion illustration. Let me know all of that down below in the comments. Make sure you leave a like, comment, and subscribe on this video if you did enjoy it. But that will pretty much do for this video. I'm out.